I want to be perfectly clear with what I'm about to say. You don't need to have a beast of a computer to be a good 3D artist. However, the tools that we use can definitely make our lives easier. So, there's a video that you guys have been requesting. What PC components do I have? What PC components do I recommend? Are there any extra tools or elements that I find essential for my workflow? Let's go. The first thing you need to know is that when buying a computer, you have two main options. You buy the computer a pre-built element or a pre-built module, or you build it yourself. I've personally been building my computers for the past like 15 years. I love the process, I enjoy it, and it does allow you to save a little bit of money because you have more control over which specific things you need. Now, in terms of the components, there are 5 essential components that I do want to be very specific about and tell you which things I look for. First of them is processors. There's 2 main brands of processors in the world right now, or at least the big ones, right? And it's AMD versus Intel. I currently have an AMD 9950X3D, which allows me to have a very, very powerful CPU for 3D stuff and also for gaming, because I do like to play computer games. Now, what are the things that you need to look for when looking at a processor? When you look at any processor online, you're going to get information about, first of all, the technology that it is using, which in this case we normally refer to as the socket. For this AMD Ryzen that I have, it's using the Zen 5 technology, which is the AM5 socket that I'm going to explain in just a second about motherboards. And what you want to see is this thing right here, number of CPU cores and a number of threads. So the CPU cores, you can think of them as the little brains that you have inside of your processor. The more brains you have, well, the more powerful it is. Only, and this is very important, only for softwares that allow something that's called multi-threading, right? You can see it right here. There are certain softwares, there are certain games, for instance, that only access one of the little brains of your CPU and they don't know how to utilize the resources from all of the other ones. In those cases, then you need to look at the second thing, which is this thing right here, the base clock. The base clock is, let's say, how smart that brain is, right? How fast it can process and do all of the calculations to get you the result that you want. In this case, again, for instance, this one, it has 16 CPU cores and it has a base clock speed of 4.3 gigahertz. Of course, the more gigahertz you have, the better it is. You're usually going to see this sort of stuff right here, which is the boost clock. This is if you want to get into overclocking. I'm going to be completely honest. I've never done overclock in my life. I'm very scared of doing that because I don't feel like I'm really going to be extracting that much extra juice for what I normally do. And you risk like breaking or damaging your components and they can be quite expensive. So when looking for a computer, you need to look for these things. What CPU it's using, the amount of cores that it has, and the clock speed of those cores. I'm going to show you 2 examples of good PCs and bad PCs. Let's take a look at this PC. This PC is in Mexican pesos. This is maybe like an $1,100 PC, which is not bad. If we take a look at the processor, you're going to see that we have the Ryzen 5 9600. And if we quickly go into the general specification of this one right here, you're going to see that we have only 6 CPU cores, right? Compared to the 16 that we have on this one right here. And we have a base clock of 3.9, again, compared to the 4.3. Don't get me wrong. This is a perfectly good like CPU to do a lot of stuff, even gaming and things like that. Very important. It also uses the Zen 5 and the AM5 family of like sockets that we're going to talk about in the motherboards. If you pick a processor for your computer that is newer in terms of technology, then it should last you a little bit longer. That's a very common question that I get asked. How often do I change computers? And it really depends on when I start feeling like my computer is sort of like lagging a little bit with the stuff that I do in 3D related or in games. And I tend to change my components roughly every 3 to 4 years. However, this is not the norm. There's people that do it every single year. It's of course a lot of money, but you don't need to do that. However, the old computer that I had, the one that I had before this one, that I did a lot of the courses and content with, it's still there. I still use it as another PC that I have here now on my house. So a computer can last you up to, I would say, like 10 years. Once the operating systems and the softwares and the updates become like way too heavy for the computer to be able to process properly, that's when computers start getting, you know, a little bit slow and a little bit difficult to work with. So this one right here, again, comparing to a bigger processor, has less brains and the brains are a little bit less powerful. Again, not a big issue at all. The Ryzen series will be using the number first. So you have, I believe it's Ryzen 3, 5, 7, and 9 as the first number. And that's going to tell you how many brains it has. The more or the bigger the number, the more brains, so the more CPU cores it's going to have. And then this one right here will tell you a couple of other specifications. I don't want to go too much into details here, but just know that the bigger the numbers over here, it usually also means that it's a better processor. Now, this is very important. It happens both with Intel processors and with AMD processors. Some processors have an integrated graphics card with them. This means that they can display image, right? Like you can see your screen, you can even play games and stuff like that. But the integrated graphics that they have, since it's on the chip, right? And it's a very small chip, that is going to make it very difficult to run 3D softwares. So you always want to have the next one that's very important, which is a dedicated graphics card. There's two main competitors in the graphics cards so far. Hopefully, I do like competition because it breeds innovation, right? So hopefully we get more options in the future that can compete against these two giants. But right now, the two ones are NVIDIA and AMD. I 100% will tell you, pick NVIDIA. Why? Because NVIDIA has a specific technology called CUDA cores, and the CUDA cores are utilized in a lot of softwares. Blender, Marvelous Designer, Unreal Engine, Maya, like there's a lot of softwares that will use the CUDA technology. They're optimized to use those cores to perform their functions. So as a 3D artist, you are losing quite a bit of tools and resources if you decide to go with AMD. However, that doesn't mean that you cannot go with AMD. AMD is perfectly fine. It's a really good graphics card. If you're just going to be doing things like ZBrush and maybe like Substance Painter, you're not going to be doing like heavy simulations and things like that, then AMD is perfectly fine, and it tends to be a little bit cheaper. Now, which graphics card should I pick? Well, NVIDIA released the 5000 series card. This is one of the reasons why I'm doing this video. They released it this year, earlier this year, or later last year, and it's been, you know, a little bit controversial. The reason why it's been controversial is because one of the things that they're doing with these graphics cards, especially for games, is that they're including a lot of AI stuff. They're generating fake frames so that your game looks and feels very smooth, even though it's not actually rendering all those frames. You know that for a game to run smoothly, we need at least 60 FPS, right? So every second, your computer needs to create 60 images and then quickly display them to you on your computer screen. If you're dealing with a very heavy game, right, like maybe Monster Hunter Wilds or Battlefield 6, right, that's about to release, well, you want to have a smooth experience. So what they're doing is they're creating fake frames on the go, right, like very, very quickly, so that instead of having 60 FPS, you maybe have 120 FPS. And if you combine it with a monitor, which we're going to talk about later, then at that point, you're going to get like a very smooth experience, even though they're fake frames. I personally don't have an issue with them, to be honest. I think they're good. Like they do give me a nice like result, unless you're doing things like, I don't know, CSGO or things where the latency and everything has to be like almost pixel perfect. I don't really feel any difference, and it does help with a smoother experience. But here's the downside. If we go to the specifications of, for instance, the 5080 and the 4080 Super, which was like the equivalent of the last one, you're gonna see that we're only getting an 11% increase in performance overall. So the price can quickly go up in terms of like the more modern technology, and you're not really seeing that much of a boost. This is one of the big complaints that people had with this new generation, the fact that, especially as gamers, you expect to have a big increase in FPS and in performance when you're investing that much money, and we really weren't getting that, to be honest. One of the things that I always look for in my graphics cards are, as I mentioned, the CUDA cores. And you can check right here that the RTX 5080 has 10,752 CUDA cores, and the 4080 Super has 10,240 CUDA cores. So it's only like 500 more CUDA cores. It's not that much. It's not that much of an increase. I'm going to show you a different comparison here. One of the first computers that I had was the GTX 1080. This was back in 2017. This was when I started my little studio and my things here in Mexico. And I updated it in roughly 2021 with the 3080 Ti. And you can see that in this particular one, there was a big jump in performance. Look at this, almost 44.5% increase in performance from one generation to another. So I skipped the second generation, or the 2000 generation, and I went to this one right here. And look at this, like I remember trying the 3080 the first time and it felt like driving the freaking Ferrari. We went from 3,584 CUDA cores all the way to 10,240, a very, very big increase. So especially for us, again, as 3D artists using this type of technologies, it was a big, big jump. Now, if you ask me today, which card should I get? I will always ask you first, what's your budget? If you can afford, for instance, to get a 5080, a 5070, a 5090, right? Those are great cards. They're going to give you a really, really good result. But if you're on a budget, even the 3000 series, as you just saw with the 3080 Ti, it's still a beast. You might not be able to play all your games at 4K resolution, 6 FPS, and the best latency possible, right? Like it's not going to be able to achieve that, especially with modern games that are not as optimized. But especially for 3D work, you're not going to have that much of an issue, except if you look into this. A very important thing about the graphics cards is that you need to check how many VRAM you have. VRAM has become more and more important in the past couple of years. And for instance, the 1080 Ti that I mentioned before had 11 gigabytes of VRAM. The 3080 Ti only had one more gigabyte at 12 gigabytes. And I can tell you, especially working with big scenes, big 4K assets inside of Substance, inside of Unreal, it started to get a little bit laggy because it was trying to load way too much information with textures and it was a little bit difficult to work. So if you know that you're going to be using a lot of images, a lot of texturing, or very big renders, for instance, I do recommend trying to get a graphics card that has way more VRAM. The 4080 Super, for instance, unfortunately is no longer being produced. They are producing only the 5000 series, but if you can find a used one that had a good quality of life and it's in a good condition, this one's really good because it has 16 gigabytes of VRAM, which is really nice. The 5080, which is again the one that I'm currently using, also has 16 gigabytes of RAM, but I would love if it would have been possible to get the 24 gigabytes, to be honest. Now, before we continue, I know you guys are not subscribed. We have the information. So if you like these videos and you're learning, which is the most important thing, please subscribe to the channel. It really helps us out. And let's continue. Now, the next component, and this is very important, is of course the motherboard. Okay, and this is a place where a lot of people mess up quite badly. So the motherboard will have a specific type of socket depending on which component you're using. If you're using a Ryzen component like this one right here, you can see that it's looking for the AM5 socket. So you need to look for an AM5 motherboard. But here's a very common thing that people do. They cheap out on their motherboard, and the motherboard, it's literally the frame that assembles all of the different elements. So the more intense or the more powerful your motherboard is, the better it's going to be to use the resources. You probably have heard this term before, which is called the bottleneck, and this happens when you have a very strong component and it doesn't have enough room to send all of that juice into your PC. The motherboard can possibly be a bottleneck situation. Let's take a look at this one, for instance. There's different manufacturers of motherboards. I strongly recommend that you do your own research, but let's take a look at this one, which I believe is the one that I have, to be honest. So this one is the Gigabyte Aorus, and it will tell me what kind of stuff it has, right? Very important. Whenever you're researching, guys, don't get like blown away by all of this information. They're always going to try to sell you this kind of stuff. You need to go to the actual specification and see what's going on. So the first thing that you're going to notice with motherboards is, again, the name. The name is sort of like the architecture that they're using. As I've mentioned, I'm using this one right here, the B6050M, which is still a sort of like high-end elements, not the highest of them. Like I could have gone with something a little bit bigger, but I had a very bad experience with one of this breaking from another brand, so I just wanted to have something that worked with this computer. But if you go to this is where we're going to see what's going on. So first of all, we got to make sure that this is the AM5 socket, and this is the important thing. We need to check what type of memory it's using. In this case, it's using the DDR5 RAM memory, and how many PCIe slots we have, because these PCIe slots are the ones that we're going to be using for things like graphics cards or audio cards or things like that. A very important thing that you need to check with your motherboard is how much RAM you can actually install and at what speed can that RAM be. We're going to talk about that in just a second. So as you can see, it supports DDR5 with all of these different speeds, and it can have up to 256 gigabytes, meaning that you're going to have 4 64 gigabyte single DIMM capacity memories. So 256 gigabytes of RAM is like completely overkill, especially again for the stuff that we usually do here in the channel. But if you want to go like completely overboard, though, there you go. Make sure to check this, because if your motherboard does not support all of the elements that you want, we're going to have some issues. Another very important thing is this thing right here. You need to check the kind of ports it has. We're not going to be connecting our displays to here, right? Like it has 2 HDMI ports, it seems. It also has a USB Type-C port, which could be really cool because this one in particular has a display port. So some graphic tablets will have that information. You can check, of course, the audio, the internet, stuff like that. Wi-Fi, if you're going to be doing Wi-Fi, I don't recommend that, of course. But yeah, that's pretty much it. Now, if so far all of this is too much and you're feeling like a little bit overwhelmed, don't worry. One site that I've recommended before, and we're not sponsored or anything, is this one, PC Part Picker. And the reason why this one's so good is because you can, again, choose a CPU, and once you select this one and you go to the next one, which is going to be the motherboard, you're going to be able to select whatever motherboard is compatible with that one. So you're going to see that on the socket, it already tells me, yeah, this is AM5, so you shouldn't have any issue. So I can select any of the ones that I want, depending on, again, how many memory slots we want, the max memory that we can have, the form factor. Form factor is the size of the plate. Usually ATX is the way to go, unless you want to have like a very small system. Just as a little side note, you are going to need a cooler. You can pick either an air cooler or a water cooling system. Both of them are really good. Unless you're doing overclocking, it's not really going to be that much, but just pick a one that is really good depending on the size of your CPU. So the more powerful your CPU, for instance, the one I have right here is gets very hot. Therefore, I need a very sort of like strong CPU cooler. If your processor is not as strong, you might not need something as big. I personally recommend, again, like water cooling, because I think it looks nice and it's good, but I've seen some results and some tests where things like this one, for instance, the Noctua or the Thermalright Assassin, just air cooling is more than enough, and sometimes it can be a bit cheaper. So that's 3 components out of the way. Let's take a look at the last one, or the second to last one, which is the memory, the RAM, right? So as you know, or as we saw with the motherboard, we need to use this DDR5 memory. Please don't make this mistake. I've made it in the past, unfortunately, and I had to find someone to sell the stick that was the wrong one that I needed. DDR5 and DDR4 are completely different things. So you need to check which motherboard you have, and depending on the motherboard, you're going to pick the specific DDR5 or 4, depending on which architecture you're using. So this thing right here, DDR5, and then a big number, that's the number, again, of the clock speed. You need to think of RAM as extra little brains that are going to be the calculations on the go without having to sort of like save them in any other part of your system. So RAM is rapid access memory, right? That's what it means. So we want to have a lot of memory if possible so that we can access it quickly. And again, the higher this speed right here, the better is going to be. So you can see that we have 6,000 as sort of like the basis that most DDR5 have right here, but there are some that go 6,400, some of them go all the way to like 7,500. And then there's another little secret number that I didn't learn until after I built this last computer, which is the CL36 memory. This CL number is the latency of the memory. Again, this is nitpicking. I'm trying to be as specific so you guys have all of the tools. But if you take a look at some of them, you're going to see that some are going to be CL36, which again is one of the most common ones. And the higher the price goes, for instance, this one right here, you're going to see that it goes down, CL30. So CL is again the latency at which the RAM is going to be doing all of its processes. I would say the gain is again sort of like minimal. You're not going to be seeing, thank you, Opnis, for the follow. You're not going to be seeing all of these things clearly in your workflow, but it's a good thing to remember. So the lower the CL, the better the memory. The higher the clock speed, the better the memory. Again, keep in mind, sometimes some of these things need to be tweaked once you install your computer, and I'm one of those guys that prefers to play it safe, and if I don't need to like overclock and push everything to the limit, I'll just buy something that is efficient, a good price, and good for my workflow. Finally, we are going to need another, again, very important thing, which is, of course, the storage. Nowadays, there's different types of storage. You're going to have this M2 form factors SSD elements, and this is the ones that I normally recommend to have as your basics or like operating system drive. So if we go to my PC, I have a lot of drives. Some of them are almost full, like this one right here. My local disk is a 1 terabyte M2 SSD, and this is where I have Windows installed and all of my files. Some of this are traditional HDD drives. For instance, this one right here is an 8 terabyte HDD drive where I save all of the recordings and the information. And all of this other ones, this 2 terabyte, and I believe this 4 terabyte, no, this 4 terabyte is also an HDD. But this one, for instance, this 2 terabyte is another SSD, like a traditional SSD drive. So how many drives do you need? It's up to your workflow. I personally recommend get at least one of these ones right here, one nice M2 SSD for, again, the operating system and maybe most of the softwares. And then if you want, you can do one of this other like more traditional SSDs, like this one right here, 1 terabyte, 2 terabytes, where you can install more software, games, and things like that. The SSDs are better in speed because they are faster, right, than HDD, but the HDD is a lot cheaper and it allows you to save a lot of information, so don't sleep on those either. You might not be able to get the best performance if you're trying to play or do something, but for a lot of cache and things like that, they're quite efficient as well. And that's it. With that done, you pretty much have the 5 components that you need: motherboard, processor, graphics, RAM, and storage. After that, of course, there's the accessories. And for the accessories, you're going to need water cooling for your CPU. You're going to need your case. You don't need a fancy case. A lot of this sort of like fish tanks are the famous ones. I actually have one because they do look fancy. I'm not going to lie. But you don't need one of this. If you can get like a very cheap, nice one with this, just make sure that the airflow is nice, that the fans are going in the proper direction. Usually, the normal configuration nowadays is to have a couple of fans on the front, 3 or 2, bringing in air, right? Like they're bringing in cool air. They cool everything, and then these fans right here, they push the air out, right? So all of the hot air that's being generated by your graphics cards and your CPU, they're going to be pushed out through the back and through the top because, you know, hot air goes up. There's usually another fan on the power supply that's also bringing in a little bit of air here. So most of the fans are going to go again in that sort of like direction, from front to back, from bottom to the top, so that it has a nice airflow. Some people go overboard and they add fans everywhere. You don't need this, and be careful when doing this, because you can generate something like this, sort of like weird loops where air's getting trapped inside of the case and it gets really, really hot. So yeah, just be careful. But once again, if you have the money and you want to like have like a super fancy looking element, well, there you go. You can go with really, really crazy elements here. Just make sure that the size, the ATX or mini ATX size matches the motherboard that you're using. Another common issue is people buy an extremely big case and a very small motherboard and it looks very weird, or the other way around, they buy this very huge motherboard or this huge graphics card and then the case is very small. So make sure that it can fit the very big bulky pieces that you're going to be using. Now, if you want specific budgets about which particular components to buy, you can still check the video from last year. I'm not going to go through the exercise right here, but again, PC Part Picker is the way to go. Just set yourself a budget. There's sometimes this completed builds that you can also check. And if you go here, you're going to see some builds that people have done. They're going to see how much it costs right here on the bottom section. I know this prices change depending on what part of the world you're in, but you can at least see them or use them as a little bit of a reference. So for instance, this one right here at $1,200, I think it's quite nice. Let's take a look. There we go. Ryzen 5 B650M motherboard, 32 gigabytes of RAM at 6,000 clock speed, CL Leal 30, not bad. 2 TB for storage. In this case, he's using a Radeon. I would change this for maybe an NVIDIA, again, for the 3D things that we normally use. But this is not bad. Like, I would consider this a very decent, sort of like mid-budget PC for 3D creation. I know this might seem like a lot of money, but keep in mind, if you're doing this as a business, not just as a hobby, but actually as a business, hopefully you're going to be making this back relatively quickly, and then it just becomes an asset for your creation stuff. Now we're going to go to another part, and this is a very interesting one, which is peripherals for your stuff. And I'm going to say, the first thing you should get as a 3D artist, before you look into fancy monitors, before you look into fancy mouses, keyboards, chairs, anything, you need to get yourself a tablet. There's multiple brands of tablets out there. As you know, I like to use Huion. This video, again, is not sponsored by them, but they've been sponsors of the channel. And one of the things that I like about them is that the quality and the price is quite good. Now, you don't need a pen display. This is another very common issue or common problem. My students, they want to have the most fancy pen displays ever. You don't really need this. You can start with a very simple tablet, no pen display. The first tablet that I had cost me like $50 or something like that. It was a Wacom Bamboo tablet, very nice one. I really liked that one. And then I changed into a Wacom Intuos Pro, which was a little bit bigger. Again, no pen display. And later in my artistic career was that I did the switch to pen displays, which I really enjoy. But I do recommend, again, before you invest in anything else, you do need to get a nice tablet. You cannot, and please take this as honestly and as nicely as possible, you cannot be a 3D artist nowadays without a tablet. You need a pen display or a pen tablet, because if you don't have one, sculpting gets very difficult, texturing gets very difficult, doing a lot of the stuff that we do, drawing and like moving things around, gets very difficult. So strongly recommend it that you invest on that. Now, for the rest of the peripherals, it's up to you which one you feel more comfortable with. Personally, for instance, I use this Corsair MMO mouse. It's the Scimitar Pro, and I really like it. Let me see if I can show it to you. There we go. I really like it because it has the buttons on the sides, and I can use these buttons to map most of the like shortcuts that we have instead of Substance, Maya, Blender, just 1, 2, 3. We use those numbers quite commonly. If you want to use one of those like super fancy racer mouses, or if you want to use like a very traditional mouse, you can use one of those vertical mouses. It's up to you. It doesn't really matter. The mouse is not going to make you a better artist. For keyboards, I have this one right here. It's the Razer Widowmaker V3. It's a smaller form factor. You can see that I don't have the number pad and I'm missing a couple of keys. I really like it because it's small and it's wireless, so I can move it around if I need to. But I do miss my number pad, to be honest. So if I ever upgrade this, or if I upgrade this in the next couple of months, I'm probably going to go for something that's a little bit bigger so that I get access to my F keys and my number pad, because I do feel like I need them for some softwares. But again, you can pick whichever one you want. There's really no big difference. I personally like mechanical keyboards. They do not make me a better artist. I just like the clicky clackety thing of the keyboards. Other than that, I do recommend a good chair. I know this sounds like a little bit stupid, but you are going to be sitting on your computer for long periods of time. And if your chair is not comfortable or it's not ergonomic, you're going to start getting some pain on your back, some pain on your arms, on your wrists, on your elbows. And we need to take care of our bodies, right? Like we're doing a very sedentary, like a job. And it's important that we, of course, move and stand up every now and then, but also have the proper tools to work with. I have this chair right here, which is sort of like a gaming chair. It's quite cushioned. It's nice. I have some armrests. I have these things right here for my keyboard and mouse to rest my palms on. I know some people say they're not like good. To me, they've been helpful. So it really depends, but I do recommend try to be as ergonomic and as comfortable as possible so that you don't strain yourself and get injured. We would not like that, right? So that's pretty much it, guys. Now, I know I didn't tell you specifically, get this component, get this component, get this component, because if I tell you that and then something doesn't work for you, you're going to blame me, and I don't want that to happen. We're friends, right? So what I wanted to do with this video is show you the things that we normally look for in the components that we buy. Now, feel free to leave a comment here with the specs of the system, and I'll give you my feedback. I'll give you my opinion of whether I think those are good or not. You don't need to have the biggest budget to start. You don't need to have the biggest tools, but you do need to look for those elements. And when you upgrade, which is one of the big advantages of building your own PC, you can remove one part, upgrade it, sell the old part, and just get a little bit of money back. When you do that, you now are going to know what things to look for. I do want to make a video about like softwares and things like that you might need as tools. Let me know if that's something that you guys want to learn about. And yeah, maybe we'll prepare that for the next couple of days, okay? So that's pretty much it for this one, my friends. Again, if you have any questions or if you have more information, please share that here in the comments and we'll be happy to learn from everyone. That's it, my friends. Don't forget, always learning, always improving. I'll see you this Friday for our live stream. Let's go.